I mean, there are two things that people should never look into, and that is what goes into the workings of record companies and what goes into the making of sausages. You don't want to know.
Yeah. That's all well and good, Pete, but I still want to know how one of the most recognisable heavy metal brands went from this
That's not the way it feels.
to this.
I'm sure now you know. It's entitled Curse on the Pharaoh.
For the past 40 years, no less than 265 bands have at some point featured on the Roadrunner Records roster. The journey from those first signings up to today has been marred with successes and controversies, which culminated in a mass cull of staff and in turn signed artists in April 2012. As of right now in 2021, only about 20 artists bear the Roadrunner label, 3 of which are fronted by Corey Taylor. That's like 15%. To start our journey, we need to venture back into 1970s Netherlands.
But not everyone loved disco.
This is now officially the world's largest anti-disco rally.
The record industry was facing its first major crisis since its rise through the 1950s and 60s. As is with most industry bubbles, a downturn in record sales and business revenue is attributable to the emerging technologies of the time, increased exposure to music broadcasts in public places, and generally a more varied roster of recreational activities for consumers to enjoy. It's also been commented that the post-war population boom which brought about the music industry's target demographic was diminishing, as said by then Managing Director of CBS Records Netherlands, Koos de Vries. That's the result of the pill. As a result, the target group of 12 to 20-year-olds is decreasing drastically. In our future projections, we assume that our target group will be reduced by 4 to 5 million consumers for Europe, while the 12 to 20-year-olds have always been our largest target group. One thing that disguised the decline in record sales was the overwhelming success of Saturday Night Fever. The smash hit broke sales records in 1977 and moved disco from a fringe movement into a mainstream trend. An article by Miss Solania sets the scene. Disco started showing up everywhere. In 1978, the state of New York declared one week in June National Disco Week. On television, Dance Fever and Soul Train were ratings hits. Film scores to popular movies like Star Wars and Superman were being re-released as disco mixes. Even Disney got into the act with the 1980 album Mickey Mouse Disco. Established rock artists added some disco elements to many of their songs in the late 1970s, further angering die-hard disco fans and alienating their own long-time listeners. For example, the Rolling Stones' Miss You, Wings, Silly Love Songs, and even the Grateful Dead's Shakedown Street. To further illustrate the impact of disco's popularity, Netherlands label Polygram's US market share had grown from 5% to 20%. For a short while in the late 1970s, it was the world's largest record company. Slowly, a counter-movement began to spread throughout the United States. In the popular movie spoof Airplane, audiences cheered when the doomed plane knocked down a disco station's antenna. And on the sitcom WKRP in Cincinnati, rock DJ Dr. Johnny Fever regularly wore his Disco Sucks t-shirt. It was becoming cool to hate disco.
Disco sucks. Disco sucks. Disco sucks.
The combination of an oversaturated market and the decline of a returning consumer base would lead to a dramatic drop in revenue for the record industry. As described by Dr. Gerben Becker in his 2003 review of the history of Polygram. Before 1978, the overconfident Polygram expanded it aggressively, constructing 3 large, fully automated distribution centers in California, New Jersey, and Indianapolis. Managers optimistically ordered large numbers of records in advance without knowing the demand. During 1978, all of this was going fine, but when in late 1979, the disco boom busted, everything went wrong. Polygram managers used a pipeline metaphor. The distribution pipeline was 6 inches high, while the products only took 2 inches. The over-optimistic ordering of records by managers further aggravated the problem. For example, the 1978 Sgt. Pepper's film flopped, but the album still sold 3 million copies. However, Polygram had pressed and distributed 8 million, and US retailers could return any unsold copies. Losses climbed to a reported $300,000 a day by 1983. It was suggested by Polygram Netherlands co-director Rob Stoit that as far as the future is concerned, our right to exist depends on the possession of performing rights. If you don't have them, in fact if we don't get them today, we better start cleaning up a family grave, because that's where we'll all end up in. So how are disco, polygram and performing rights relevant to a heavy metal label? Well, the very lessons learned in that disco bubble burst will leave a lasting impression in the way that Roadrunner would operate. The earliest mention of Roadrunner Records I could find was in an August 1976 issue of Cashbox magazine, detailing that they had just completed a distribution deal with International Record Distribution Association, or IRDA for short, to support the release of the Del Wood single Chosen Children. This is of course not the Roadrunner we're talking about, but a completely random and striking coincidence even down to the abbreviated distributor, for which you'll shortly learn why. The Roadrunner Records we know was forged in 1981 by two partners, founder of Dutch record wholesaler and distribution company Bertus, Jorn van der Linden, and ex-Polygram and RCA executive Kees Wessels. Not a great deal is known about Kees prior to his time at Roadrunner Records, but what can be confirmed is that by the time Roadrunner Records comes around, Kees is already a true veteran of the record industry. Here's a couple of anecdotes that might give you an idea. Firstly, concerns a Dutch band Q65. In a recent book about the Hague Group by Pim Scheelings in 2009, guitarist Jupe Roylofs says, to increase our brand awareness and promote the single The Life I Live, the record company decided in 1966 that we, as long-haired scum, had to sail a dinghy from London to Scheveningen. We cursed Phonogram and the label manager Kees Wessels, who came up with this great stunt. After a while, the pier of Scheveningen came into view. It seemed like no one was there. Nice mess, we thought, and no dog showed up. But the closer we got to the pier, the more people we saw. It looks back, about 10,000. They came because Radio Veronica had broadcast every hour. This afternoon, Q65 lands in Scheveningen. We gave a press conference, then performed in front of 10,000 people. The Life I Live became a huge hit because of all that hoopla. It shot straight to the top 5. Next I've got an anecdote in relation to the group Cuby and the Blizzards. In 1969, the album Appleknockers Flophouse was set to be released. Kees Wessels and Anton Wiltkamp, the label manager and copywriter at Phonogram at the time, came up with this publicity stunt. They invited a number of farmers from the area of Weezup at Willems Perkans bar for a cover photo session with the band. There was free food and drinks for all, and when the farmers were reasonably drunk, Kees Wessels brought in a stripper, who did a strip act on the bar. A sensation back in those days. The farmers loved it. When they sobered up the next day and discovered the whole thing was photographed and filmed, they panicked. The local mayor took up arms to protect his citizens from a scandal. So the pictures were not allowed to be used. Thus the album cover contains only the very cheerful band. The film made by the VARA has never been broadcast, despite frantic efforts to retrieve it. So that's the most detailed pair of accounts I can find on Kees Wessels in his career prior to Roadrunner. However, I have got a very quick sort of roadmap to all the places he used to work prior to starting Roadrunner. So let's go. In 1973, he's listed as being the sales manager for Phonogram in Wellington, New Zealand, occupying a lovely building right in the middle of town. In 1974, he's moved to Mercury to be the international release coordinator back in Holland. 1975, he's back at Phonogram as the international head of A&R, still in the Netherlands. Here's an article where Kees is credited with the international surge in popularity of the Bachman Turner Overdrive, which is oddly poetic, as the very same artist would inspire another key character in the Roadrunner story, but more on that later on. I tell you what, he's not one for smiling, is he? In 1979, he's moved from Polygram Phonogram to RCA as managing director of RCA Netherlands. This is the position he'll hold until the end of 1980, where RCA Netherlands and RCA Belgium were merged into an amalgamated RCA Benelux, and Kees was a casualty of the cost-cutting venture. Here's a story from Roadrunner's first employee, Dennis Kloot, about Kees' initial engagement for RCA.
I said, so where are you going to have your office? Not too far away. There's a brilliant, beautiful villa that I can rent. He says, come, we walk over. So we walk over, and it's about 20-minute walk. He says, this is the building. I said, Kees, this is a whorehouse. Not anymore, he says. It was a whorehouse. I used to bring artists to that place, for these guys to have a fuck.
So that brings us to the 1980s. So I said earlier that the Roadrunner Records that we know was formed in 1981. However, Roadrunner as a legal entity actually existed 3 years prior. Specifically, Roadrunner Productions BV was a company formed by Case on the 20th of January 1978. So here's an email I got from Jan van der Linden. Case wanted to start a company to produce all kinds of gadgets to sell in chain and department stores, the buyers of which he knew from his time as label manager of RCA Netherlands. This is the time he and his family had just returned from Australia, where Case had been the director of RCA. I'm not entirely sure when Case went to Australia in his capacity as a director of RCA, but I'm sure it will all become clear one day. On February the 27th, 1981, I took over 50% of the shares from Case. In addition to selling sound carriers to outlets where he was well introduced to and interested me, he also wanted to remain a producer of gadgets, which in the early days of our partnership led to the production of cassettes, such as language courses and children's stories like Strawberry Shortcake translated into Dutch. There's another example of an early oddity as well.
At the very beginning, Case has a long history in music, and he worked at major labels.
Yes.
And the very first release on Roadrunner, if I remember well, he did some children's music, some children's records.
Okay.
Kids music, I mean, with it, right? So kids singing for kids.
After a short stint on Discogs.com, I found Roadrunner's breakout product.
Dan opeens gebeurt er toch een wonder. Deze dag wordt weer eens heel bijzonder. Hey, goeiemorgen, dikke lakjes kaas. Nou, wat kun jij toch spinnen?
Jan goes on to describe that the Case's engagement at the start of 1981 was to represent the UK-based Pickwick Records in the Netherlands, with his latest outfit, Top Budget. That was until Jan convinced him to go it alone with a record label. The pair are far from metalheads themselves, but Jan's colleague at Bertus, Dirk van Hoefel, was able to tip the newfound label off to which records were selling well over at Bertus's wholesale operation. At its inception, the standard working day at Roadrunner Records would see Jan handling the back-end functions of the label, finances, administration, management, whereas Case would take the mantle of being the face of Roadrunner, managing the relationships with other figures in the industry, artists, label and managers alike. What might surprise you is that the first Roadrunner office was located on Willemspark, Amsterdam, and looks remarkably like a house. Because it is.
So the ground floor, first the office was in the Willem van Egenstraat in Amsterdam. The ground floor was the office, and 2 sets of stairs up was where he was living.
By he, Mike means Case. Case was running Roadrunner out of his front room.
The living room from the front to the back was at least 15-20 meters. And in that room was completely empty. The only thing that was there was a huge table plus 3 huge sofas. That was his office in the beginning.
But why call it Roadrunner? Ladies and gentlemen, if you would please reach under your seats and pull out your tinfoil hats, I have 2 theories. First, the more romantic of the 2 theories. If you read up on the aforementioned band Cuby and the Blizzards, one of the first things you might see are early comparisons to the British outfit, the Pretty Things. Now, the Pretty Things were a garage rock band signed to Fontana Records and are considered by some to be one of the early examples of proto-metal, along with bands like the Kinks and the Yardbirds. The 4th single on the band's self-titled debut in 1965 was a cover of a Bo Diddley song, Roadrunner. Now that red looks a bit familiar, doesn't it? Fontana would then be acquired by, you guessed it, Polygram in 1972. Now let's open up that fucking pit, lads, come on! Now for the less romantic theory. According to the Urban Dictionary, a roadrunner is a person that chases money very often. Given that Roadrunner Productions BV was formed while Case was the head of International A&R, it stands to reason that the name of the company was a tongue-in-cheek projection of Case's love for the hustle. Okay, now for the most likely reason.
Case used to be a runner of marathons, half marathons, full marathons. And he always said to me, actually, I'm a roadrunner.
To get things moving, Roadrunner initially refrained from directly signing bands to make records, instead specialising in the licensing and distribution of products through the Benelux area.
All right, and then the first couple of records he released, I think rock music, was Jim Croce. Case had a relationship with Jim Croce from the past, so he released Jim Croce albums.
It is correct about the Jim Croce records being the first LPs out the door, but there were plenty of other eclectic gems in the initial Roadrunner offerings.
one of the very first records that Roadrunner ever put out, and possibly was the first album Roadrunner ever put out, was by a very cult German underground act called Liaison Dangerous. And actually, there's a single called Los Niños del Parque, which I bought when it came out on Mute Records. It was a very early Mute release in the UK in 1982. Like now, that is held up as one of the seminal, underground electronic post-punk dance records.
This trend of licensing eclectic, diverse music and distributing it in the Benelux area was the standard operation for Roadrunner Records at the time. It wasn't until Aardschok magazine's owner, Metal Mike, turned up at Case's office with something he hadn't seen before.
Well, it was a lot of new bands bubbling on there. Nobody, in our music magazines, you only could read about Kiss, Status Quo, and AC/DC. I had much more bands, actually. And so I started a magazine myself. And because I was a fan of the new wave of British heavy metal, I traveled to England a lot. And I also went to Port Vale a couple of times. There was a huge warehouse there. In England, there were two musical newspapers, NME and Sounds. I think they were bi-weekly, and one week was NME and the other week was Sounds that came out. And they always had advertisements in there. And one was of a warehouse in Port Vale. And why I tell you this, I was in Port Vale and taking all the singles out of the racks to trade with pen pals all over the world. And a box came in, a big carton box, and they opened it up there to put it in the racks for their distribution, whatever. And it was a hard and heavy album by Anvil. Hey, this looks cool. Never heard of Anvil. Oh, great! Two guitar players done. Oh, they look cool. I'll get this. And there was a shipping letter in the box. So I took not only the vinyl, but also the shipping letter for this Canadian import. And when I got home one day later, I called the number on the shipping letter, and I get Al Mayer on the telephone. Al Mayer is Alexander Mayers, the head of Attic Records Canada, the boss of Attic Records. His phone number was on the shipping letter. So I got in touch with him, and I said, can you take care that, or can you make sure that this album not is only available as an import, but also that our metal fans can buy it as a European printed album vinyl, so it's not so expensive. So I'm just a metal fan doing this kind of stuff. He says, well, I heard of a guy in Hilversum who wants to start a record company. His name is Cees Wessels. I never heard of the guy, definitely not a metalhead, otherwise I know most of the metalheads, kind of, So he gave me an address, so I drove to Hilversum, and where that guy was working in a little office. I think it was part of Polygram or Phonogram, Polydor Phonogram, or I'm not sure. So I met Cees Wessels, and I gave him my copy of Anvil's Hard and Heavy, and said, well, I talked to this guy in Canada, Al Mayer, and he says, he told me that you would start a record company. Yeah, I think blah, blah, blah. So I gave him my copy, and Al Mayer sent me a new copy of the Anvil record, and that was my first meeting with Case. That's how it started out.
First thing you did was distribute to him, effectively.
I gave him the first metal record that he put out. That's how I got involved with Cees Wessels.
Similarly, Case was tipped off to another record by a soon-to-be competitor. I founded Mausoleum Records in the winter of 1982, a few weeks after I'd been fired from my job as marketing manager at Inelco. In the early 80s, Inelco in fact distributed Roadrunner. One day I actually gently nudged owner Cees Wessels to release the first Twisted Sister album, so I perhaps unknowingly created a future competitor for my then yet-to-be-born Mausoleum heavy metal label.
Then he licensed in some rock stuff. He licensed from England, some punk stuff. I think the UK shops he exploited. I was there at that time. I worked at Birds, but I was involved with the stuff. I picked the stuff up at the factory.
Yeah.
And I also think through a UK label came Twisted Sister. The very first Twisted Sister album. And around that time, when Roadrunner was still, going the punky route and Twisted Sister was there, suddenly Twisted Sister hit big in the US.
Right.
And that made the catalog album from Roadrunner, sell quite some numbers. And I think that's the moment when Case pulled definitely towards rock and metal music.
Case was an opera fan, and Jan had a passion for African music. But being the face of the business, I wondered if Case had any bearing on the metal genre at all.
No, not at all. Well, he was a smart businessman, but he didn't know jack shit about metal. Yeah. Well, that's okay, but he knew how to. And I mean, I always saw the sales sheets, and Jim Croce was selling a lot. I mean, that paid for all the bills in the company. Wow. Because metal was not that big yet, not in that big scale. The bands that sold the best were, of course, Metallica records, because they kept on selling. And I made sure that Roadrunner did Benelux, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, all the releases from Music for Nations in our part of the world. That's something I arranged with Johnny Z. Mm-hmm. Sage was surprised that the Metallica record kept on selling. Normally, an album would sell really high numbers in the first couple of weeks, and then it trickles down. Yeah. And with Metallica, it just kept on selling.
It was quite funny because in the beginning, when you had Metallica and Slayer, there was so much great stuff going on at that time, and it was those two bands, Metallica and Slayer. They were genre innovators. Yeah. Never got beaten. The innovators never get beaten. Happens in every musical genre. Yeah. There's somebody develops it, and the initiator never gets beaten. And they sold almost the same. Like, it was unbelievable. For years they sold almost the same until Metallica had Masters of Puppets, and that's when they took a big leap forward. But the first two records and the first two records from Metallica and Slayer both sold almost identically in Europe.
Yeah. Off the back of success stories like Metallica and Twisted Sister, Case set about establishing relationships with other metal labels around the world, which in turn led to other lucrative licensing opportunities. On an operational basis, it appears that Roadrunner in its infancy resembled more of a publishing house than it did a record label.
And I was only had distribution in the US. There was no distribution in Europe whatsoever at that point. And this is still, independent distribution in the early 80s was a very small, very tiny window of just a few different distributors, and there were some in Europe, but there wasn't a whole lot. So I think it was about 83 I'd put out, a few records, and I got a call one day from this guy named Case Wessels, who was starting Roadrunner Records, and he was looking for, partners and just product. And since I didn't have any sort of distribution in Europe, he said, hey, I said, this is Case Wessels from Roadrunner, blah, blah, blah. I'd be interested in licensing some of your records for distribution in Europe. What do you think? And I was like, oh, well, that sounds like a good idea. And then we kind of started the relationship from there. It was really Roadrunner and then also Music for Nations, because they were kind of partners at the time, more or less. I mean, I don't think they were really business partners, but, Martin Hooker and Music for Nations would do stuff in the UK, and the Case and Roadrunner would do it for the rest of Europe. So I didn't really have much experience with anything. I was learning on the fly. I was a 22-year-old kid at the time. Yeah. So, but we had a really good lawyer here in the U.S. and a couple people who were involved in the industry that kind of helped me through that. But we did a bunch of those things for him early on as well, and it worked. I mean, the relationship worked out great because he sold a lot of records for us in Europe, and we helped him out in the States as well.
In 1984, Roadrunner moved their offices out of Case's front room, one street over, to Van Egenstraat.
Then the office moved to the Van Egenstraat, next to the Vondelpark in Amsterdam. And there the ground floor was the Roadrunner office, and one floor up was Archer Metal Hammer. Wow. So I could use their office, so I could do their A&R work, write bios in 3 languages, because I speak English, German, and Dutch. Okay. And so work for Roadrunner and work for the magazine at the same time.
It was at this time that Roadrunner would also look to expand both its headcount and its strategy beyond simply licensing music for the European area. Roadrunner would now look to acquiring its own direct signings.
The change point was when Case Wessels realized that he no longer wanted to depend on third party as a source of repertoire.
So, with the task of removing the business dependency on third parties and instead acquiring direct signings to the growing metal outfit, one task would have to be overcome. How do two 40-something men who do not like metal acquire metal acts?
And that was also a time where I shared artist office space with Mike, who runs Aardschok magazine. But Mike was also in an A&R role for the label.
Yeah.
And I remember him always, and we always have that joke when we see each other. He would say, I would present the band to Case. Case would pass on the band. 9 months later, Case would come back to me, talk about the same band. Then it was presented to him by the lawyer in New York, and the price would be 3 times as much as 9 months ago. I think there was probably a truth into that.
If you give him recommendations, what was it that engaged him? Did he? Because he, again, as we say, he's an opera guy. So what would make him click and make him go, oh yeah, fuck yeah, let's sign this band?
I don't know. Maybe my enthusiasm, or I couldn't give him numbers and stuff. There was no. I mean, nowadays it's so easy, everything with the internet and stuff. But then it was so hard. I mean, you didn't have internet, you didn't have fax machines yet. Everything went totally different, in a totally different pace, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sending a letter to Lars offering him stuff, and a month later, maybe lucky, I get a letter back if we're not calling.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. It's hard to understand for somebody who's started, was born 20 years later.
And I think where he was really good was, although he didn't understand the musical genre fully, he did want to have the bands from today and tomorrow. He never wanted to have anything to do with the bands from yesterday. And this is where I think, but this is something underestimated. I think this is where the big difference come from Roadrunner and a lot of other labels, because in my recollection, Roadrunner was up there, right? And there was a big gap until the second label came. And I think this drive that he had, working with today's and tomorrow's bands and not be interested in yesterday's band, has made a difference.
As it turns out, chasing today's bands isn't always as simple as receiving a demo tape.
We had done a kind of a battle of the bands contest, but only for metal bands, which was called the Metal Race. And at this, but what we didn't know was that in fact the Metal Race was going to be recorded and was going to be released on Roadrunner as a compilation album of the 4 finalists of that battle. That day, the guy of Roadrunner that was there, we told him, listen, mate, we didn't know that this was going to be recorded and it was going to come out as a compilation, and we don't want that, The guy from Roadrunner that was the contact guy for the compilation album, he said Case Wessels will come personally to Brussels to meet you guys because he wants to talk the deal over with you guys again. So he came back, and then he did a deal that we kind of couldn't refuse. But part of the deal was that we would agree to release that compilation album, that we would say, okay, we take part on this Metal Race compilation album.
Now, the reason Roadrunner, the only reason probably that we ended up on Roadrunner was that this demo tape that we did, we sent loads out, and our demo tape ended up on the desk of a guy called Doug Smith, who was Motorhead's manager.
Okay, right.
So, and he managed, before that, I think he managed Hawkwind, probably, hence Lemmy connection.
Yeah.
So a copy of our demo tape just was sitting on his desk, and basically what happened was he called me up, out of the blue. My phone went, and it's like, hi, this is Doug here, Doug Smith. Oh, I was like, oh my God, I knew who he was, and he said, listen, I've got Case Vessels here in my office from Roadrunner, and he's very interested in signing the band. And I'm like, really? He said, look, come up to London and we'll talk about it. And that's basically what happened. And Doug said to me, Case was here talking about whatever, something else. And he said, he just looked round on my desk, he pointed to the Jaguar demo tape, and he said to me, get me that band. I want that band. This is what Doug told us, and we're like, whoa. And so it kind of went from there.
Now, a good chunk of the first direct signings to Roadrunner, including the bands that you can see on screen, seem to originate from the northeast of England. And after a bit of digging, it seems that they all originated in some way or fashion from Guardian Records in the Durham area. The label and its accompanying studio was run by a chap named Terry Gavigan, and typically the route to Roadrunner for these bands was the band would self-finance a recording at Guardian Studios, which is then put out by Guardian and Terry. Terry would then take on like a managerial role with the band, and then the band would inexplicably end up on Roadrunner. So here's Dave King from Battle Axe, who's going to explain a little further.
So my dad invited Case to come over and watch the band at Leeds Poly, which was our very first gig, Leeds Poly, right? And how the fuck we got signed, I don't know, because the gig wasn't that very good. And anyway, we went, you know, there was only 5 people there to vouch for it, so I can't even tell really. Anyway, we still got signed to Roadrunner for a 4-album deal, which amounted to about £32,000 in the contract, which was amazing for just coming from nowhere. Yeah, so what had happened is, we also invited Case to come up to the studios, I was telling you, to Guardian Studios, to watch us do some recording for Burn This Town, you see. That once Terry Gavigan had met Case, the next step would be to, well, if there's any other bands that you want, you know, send us the demos, you see. Simple as that. And so, yeah, any bands that were signed from Terry Gavigan after us was purely because we brought Case over, you know. I mean, we even put him up in a hotel, you know. This is the things you've got to do.
Similarly, in the US, Roadrunner would source bands from managerial relationships that existed over there. Richard Termini tells me about how he helped nudge Peter Steele towards a 21-year relationship with Roadrunner while working for New Look magazine.
And I was shopping all these, whatever it was, my own projects and all these bands to the majors. Mm-hmm. And I kept discovering people, not many people, I discovered people like Peter, for example. And I thought, you know, this is the next Pink Floyd. These guys are amazing. And I take them to the majors, you know, who eventually were doing things that I was a part of, like these pop hit records that went, you know, triple platinum and all that. So I take it to those guys, and they hated this stuff. Hated it. Said, what are you doing? This is garbage. You don't have anything to do with it. You know, that kind of thing. You know, and I'm saying to myself, you know, what's wrong with you fucking people? Are you nuts? And honestly, I think what was going on, it's just speculation because they'll never admit it, but the thing that offended people about Carnival eventually that none of us from Brooklyn saw, at least not in our crowd, until they went on tour, and then they were targeted for death by some fringe psychopaths. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yep.
I think that part of the writing, of the storytelling, remember, that's what it is. It's storytelling. These are fucking stories. I think the people I was taking this record to, that's all they heard. They didn't hear story. I think and they weren't even going to address what they thought it was. They were going to say to me, your friend's a fucking Nazi. You know, they weren't going to say that. But retrospectively, that's exactly what I think was going on, because you can't deny this music. It's ridiculous to deny what he was doing. I did a few pieces for New Look, and one was, I thought, oh, let's do a thing on CBGB, since I've been playing there since it opened. And I knew Hilly. I went down there, and it was a new scene for me to see, you know, Agnostic Front and this whole thing, because that wasn't my sort of thing. And so I found it kind of exciting because it's all new, right, for me. And seeing the mosh pits, but to quasi-metal, you know, instead of the punk. It was like an interesting hybrid. And I found it very interesting. So I took pictures of the thing and all that. And while there, I talked to Hilly about getting Peter gigs there. And he said, well, you know, tell him to come on down and we'll see how it goes and blah, blah, blah. So Hilly Crystal was open to it. You know, the owner of CB's.
Yep.
And that was great. And then while there, I think through Agnostic Front, I met Connie. She was there. Yeah, and I didn't know who she was from A Hole in the Wall. And, you know, she had the punky hair and that whole wacky sort of thing going. And but she was a proper manager, apparently. And so I told her about the band. And I gave the number and all this kind of thing. So I'm promoting them.
Yep.
So the good news is she got them a deal with Roadrunner.
Roadrunner would eventually have a relationship with the New York hardcore scene that Richard just alluded to, but again, more on that in Chapter 2. It's worth taking an aside here to point out that any dealings with Roadrunner in the United States at the time was under the name Road Racer. This was thanks to an intellectual property conflict concerning the name Roadrunner and a non-migratory omnivore. It's intriguing that, at least in the examples that I presented, that Case isn't moshing in his office to Jagger's Power Games before sending him a record contract. He's using his networking skills to gain access to the metal scene through business contacts and taking it from there. But that's not to say he was taking any band that would pick up the phone.
One thing is for sure, Satan sells. No matter how you slice it, it's not the heavy metal bands like Black Sabbath and Kiss that are losing money in the current record industry depression. In fact, some new groups seem to be picking up that satanic smell of success and following along in its path.
I think that within the rock music field, you've got people who really are into the occult and into Satan. And then you've got some who probably are playing games. But no matter how you cut it, they're propagating Satan. They're propagating the demonic line, the occultic world. And I think it's a devastating thing on our culture.
Throughout the 1980s, spate of incidents involving satanic ritual abuse spread across the globe. Typically, such events would be reports or allegations of physical or sexual abuse in the context of occult or satanic rituals. As is often fondly remembered, heavy metal was thrust into the role of the antagonist for the satanic panic. It's my tinfoil theory that Case proactively sought out bands who could be tainted with the mark of the beast to drive up interest. We're aware of Case's skills for causing a buzz around a band, and as put by Tom Watson in a 2016 article on Satanism in music, controversy sold, and the devil were paying for it. To illustrate, here's Merciful Fate's Hank Sherman. At our live shows, we had these upside-down crosses and these nuns that exploded on stage. But to me, it was basically entertainment. But to our advantage, there weren't too many bands that dealt with that stuff. We had a lot of attention going on because we were satanic preachers and all that. And King was always in interviews with Christian people on radio and on TV, so that brought a lot of attention.
So anyway, that's one reason why I got along and really loved what Peter was up to. He thought in a similar way to me in terms of big and theatrical and let's try this and let's try that.
Big concepts.
And he wasn't afraid to say God is dead, just in case, maybe, who knows? You know, it was all storytelling. It was all exploration. It's all freedom of speech. It's all the arts. I mean, the people were on television, European television. I've seen the clips, threatening his life.
Yeah.
And for what? He's a musician. What are you people insane? Like that. And so there was so much for all the positive stuff that was potentially happening. There were a lot of people that were treating what Peter was doing like it was some kind of nascent psychopathic political movement that might grow, and there'll be a massive killing.
Yeah.
And it's like, you people are out of your fucking minds. So again, credit to his label for saying fuck off and still helping him out, keeping it going. I'm amazed.
I was quite ready to bury this theory until my conversation with Neil from Spartan Warrior, who had to say this when asked how the band's relationship with Roadrunner ended. Roadrunner wanted to hear some new material. We recorded 5 songs, sent the tapes to them, and waited to hear if Roadrunner wanted to take the option or not. Roadrunner contacted us saying that they wanted us to play what they described as devil music. Luckily, before I went too far past the Hellgate, Brian Slagle brought me back to reality.
It's an interesting concept, but I think it was more just the bands of that time. That's where everything kind of went. If you look at all those bands, obviously he did Metallica and Anthrax and other bands that weren't, blatantly satanic as much as Slayer or Merciful Fate or Satan, which was another band that we put out for him in the US. I don't know. I mean, I think that there is, and this is, my perspective as well, there is a form of anti-establishment, pushing the envelope, that sort of stuff. And I grew up in the 70s with, Alice Cooper and Kiss were the most horrible people on earth, and I loved what they were doing. So there's a little bit of that, kind of shocking people, all that sort of stuff. So I think he liked that part of it. And it was pretty easy because there were so many bands around that time that were doing it anyway. But I don't know. I mean, if there was a concerted effort for him, he never told it to me, let's put it that way. But I do know that one of the reasons why he left the major label was because he wanted more freedom to do what he wanted to do and kind of wanted to go against things that were, because especially major labels in the 80s, you're trying to do anything controversial and they don't want to hear much about that. So for him, it obviously gave him a lot more freedom to do whatever he wanted. And he, founded into this whole, new heavy metal scene that nobody was really picking up on at the time. And obviously he went in full bore.
But accidental or not, the antagonistic presentation of the first Roadrunner lineup was a viable marketing tactic. Merciful Fate got publicity for making the PMRC's Filthy 15 list, and Carnival would invite prolific backlash from the more conservative types right up into the later Typo Negative years. So when dealing with Roadrunner, what's in it for the bands themselves?
When I signed with Carnivore to the label, the deal was, in fact, horrible. As a matter of fact, it was a conflict of interest because I was young and ignorant and uncircumcised at the time. The record company recommended that we use their lawyer, which we did. So he's like, everything in here is cool. Of course it was cool. So my attitude was, well, I really don't want to be some fucking rock and roller because that was never my ambition in life. Like, it was a sanitation worker. So whether I fucking pick up garbage or write it, it's the same thing, ultimately.
My reading so far indicates that the standard record deal would be for 6 to 7 records. All intellectual property and publishing is retained by Roadrunner, and the band would typically receive an advance of about somewhere around $5,000 for the first album.
Yeah, that sounds about par for the course, Jim.
Yeah, that's about it. I think that sums up a little bit of the deal.
There's no about right. That was right. The only thing that was different was that the advances varied, so they weren't necessarily $5,000 may have been the beginning of the label, but we did a little better than that later on.
Perhaps a more intricate summary can come from Satan's Russ Tippins. Actually, it was even worse than you just stated. They sent us a contract through the post which we took to a lawyer for advice. He was quite unequivocal in his scathing assessment of the terms and said, whatever you do not sign this deal. It was set out for a 5-album deal, but the label would retain the rights to the master recordings in perpetuity, meaning we would never get them back unless we bought them. Same with the publishing rights too. They proposed a £2,000 advance to make the debut LP, plus a couple £100 for an artist to draw the cover. The proposed royalty cut was 8% of 90% of the base price, not retail. Of course, we signed the deal and made the record within budget. Since then, the only royalty payment we've received from that album came from Neat after they reissued it 15 years ago. Also, there's no guarantee of tour support. My theory on this is because of the ill-fated Merciful Fate Manowar tour of England in March 1984, and Roadrunner didn't want to be tied into funding any shitty excursions that weren't expected to make any financial returns. So why was the deal so bad?
There's a different attitude. I think the work ethic and attitude is different within rock music or metal than it is in Indian alternative. Trying to say that, and I go back in my mind, it's just how I look at it. Think about this. You're a band from Birmingham, right? And there's plenty of them from 60s, 70s. And or from another part of the UK, or for that matter, US. And your choice is to either work in the mines or a steel plant or go in a band and be successful. You would sign anything to get out of that situation, right? And I'm sure that even in 80s, Thatcher era, people would sign anything to get off the dole. I had a friend of mine who were in the band. They signed to Polydor. They went from £60 a week on the dole to £100 being in the band. Simple, right?
In a way, he didn't want to miss out on the next big thing. But on the other side, if you got a couple of A&R people and they throw bands at you and you say no, and they go like, well, you got to do this one, you got to do this one. And you end up with a whole bunch of bands. And then I think Casey went back to A&R guy and said like, well, if you want them, this is the deal. And he would do that because it was cheaper. It wasn't a major investment, but I must say, like, Sepultura is one of those examples. Sepultura, I think, initially was on a deal maybe less favorable than they got later. But when the moment, when he smelled blood with them, they were on the road opening up for, I forgot, man, I think they were on the road with Biohazard.
With who, sorry?
Sodom. Yes, you're right. They were on the road with Sodom. And they just, they just basically, that's where the band initially broke over here. And that's when Case stepped up, made the investments and just broke Sepultura into the big league. They toured big. That's the thing that people forget.
Musically, Case had no real authority to tell a metal band how to exercise their craft, especially as a lot of these bands had arrived at Roadrunner with albums already recorded. However, as a marketing and salesperson, he was quite happy to influence the album's appearance for when it would sit on store shelves. However, the bands didn't always agree with handing the reins over to Case.
We had somebody that took care of the artwork, and then suddenly the artwork was changed. I received a call from Gus Rowan, the guy in between, the Case and us, who said from Monday on the record will be in the shops, So I went to the shops on Monday and I couldn't find our record. Then the guy pointed out, well, there it is, and then I saw it was a totally different cover, So we'd never seen the cover before, and they never told us they were gonna change the cover, So they didn't tell us no, we don't like your cover, or the cover has been rejected. They just decided to change the cover, and we were just left open mouth in the record store, what the fuck is this, Plus the fact that they changed the title of the album as well, it was because we never wanted to be Brutal Destruction. The original title was in fact going to be The Destroying Brutality. That was the original title. And I called Case and said what the fuck, man? You just you didn't even tell us. He said yeah, but I think Brutal Destruction sounds more commercial, And the fact he says now with the German band Destruction being so popular, it's a good thing. I said fuck off, man, and I threw down the phone,
Here's Franz from Maggie May, although for this album Roadrunner made them change their name to Wildcat. When the first records were delivered, we were shocked. We didn't know they would change the cover. Weeks before, we'd been to Munich for a photo session at the Bravo studios, at the same time as Dee Snider and Nina and so on. There were photos made, and they were intended to make up the front and back covers as well as the PR booklet, etc. So the front cover should show the girl from the backside riding a Black Panther. There were some really nice shots, but as you can see, wow.
I remember Case ringing us up. It was last week. He said, Dave, it was to me dad actually, Derek, that was the manager. Derek, can you ask the lads what ideas do they want for the cover of the album, So give us a few days, we'll think about it. So we got in touch with a couple of local artists who come up with some ideas, We something to do with motorbikes, something to do with Sunderland City now, burning down in the background because it was a shithole, So it was Sunderland to be burning down in the background and somebody on a motorbike. So this guy who we knew called Arthur Ball, not Arthur Ball, Arthur Ball, and he decided to put together a bit of what they call a proof of an artwork idea. And he was an artist at a local school in Sunderland, and he came. Concept, to see so that concept could be taken to an artist to do it properly, We said, hey, that looks good, if an artist gets hold of this, a proper graphic artist and does it properly, it'll be great. So we sent it to Case Vessels for his opinion, and 2 weeks later it came out around the world.
Similarly, here's Phil from Dark Heart. Would you believe it was a painting Case had in his house he said we had to use, as the cover we had done of a woman looking into a mirror, a wolf, was far too complex to reproduce. Even the band logo was changed. We hadn't even been asked to see the painting, so when the album did come out, we were like, what the fuck? Not expecting it to look like that. I mean, many former Roadrunner bands throughout all of history have spoken about ill treatment, or more commonly, the lack of supporting activity from Roadrunner. To go into this at this stage would be quite repetitive, and frankly this isn't a takedown piece on the label. So at this point I'll invite you to check out the full interviews on the website, the YouTube, the Spotify for now, and I'll probably go into a little bit more detail at a later date of this series. However, sometimes the working relationship with Roadrunner was so unproductive, it would lead to sometimes interesting and creative conclusions.
Basically what happened was we kind of came up with this plan, us and Doug and stuff. We came up with this plan. Let's convince Roadrunner that we'd gone disco. And seriously, I'm not lying. And the next record would be a disco album. And at that point they said, "Fair enough, okay," and they let us go.
Right. Here's Franz from Wildcat again. We didn't like the sound of the record, nor did we agree with the decisions regarding the band name and the cover. So, Joe Bleacher and our tour manager Roger Briggs went to the Federal Testing Agency for writings harmful to minors that existed at the time in Germany and filed a charge. A few weeks later, the record got X-rated and was forbidden to be sold in Germany. They nuked their own album, and that's pretty fucking metal. So what are we to make of these experiences? Were Casey and Jan kicking back behind their desks, cigar in mouths, laughing at our struggling artist heroes? Nah, I don't really think so. I mean, we already know that Roadrunner was a young company, being manned at the time by a skeleton crew, a lot of whom were still in their 20s at the start of their careers. And as we saw from Casey's career up to that point, the music business was a very volatile, very unpredictable, and not exactly a regulated industry. While I wish the communication between the label and its bands were more amicable, I also understand Roadrunner's position on the matter is that the band and its output is an asset, and if the difference between that asset making returns or becoming a financial liability hinges on the album art, or the advance of the first record, or anything like that, these are all decisions for the most experienced people in the room, which were Case and Jan.
He had licensing deals in the US for some of his artists, and I don't know which artist it was. It was an artist who had delivered an album that never got released in the US. And Case was not bothered at all. He said, "I got the advance, and that's substantial. So let's move on."
Musically, he's into opera.
Yeah.
He doesn't really care, about metal. He cares about metal, but he doesn't care about it, like a fan. But otherwise, I think he was more of a guy who just wanted to make, economic use of the situation, putting it into an economic situation.
While it's enlightening to know that Roadrunner sought to make economic returns on the innovative qualities of metal, were they the only ones who had put all their eggs in the metal basket? Fuck no. Mausoleum Metal Bleh, Noise Records ERA, New Renaissance Active Records formed through RCA, Combat Records Fringe Product, Dr. Dream, SPV, Intense Records, Neat Records, Music for Nations. Let's take a look at some of the other competition Roadrunner had to deal with. What you're seeing is just the amount of releases each label put out per year. I don't have sales or market share figures, but we can infer a measure of productivity from which each label was pushing out the door. And the labels themselves I just picked kind of at random based on, the bigger names at the time. We can see that while Roadrunner is head and shoulders above the rest in making their presence known, the market truly starts to get a little bit crowded by the mid-late 1980s. What's more, a fair amount of that traffic is coming from the United States. With all this competition building in the US territories, Roadrunner understood that being entrenched in Amsterdam wasn't really an effective strategy for expansion.
The New York office, I think, was a first strategic action, just for A&R purposes. Go to the country where your competitors are, or where the bands are, and beat them. And I think that's been the drive. And the New York office, in the end, I would say, replaced all the license deals, because suddenly he was closer to the fire, and he would have bands from New York and have a distribution set up in America. And I think, that took a big investment to do that from the Netherlands.
And so in 1986, Roadrunner opened its first US office on 225 Lafayette Street in New York City.
A real heyday. I mean, this was a real heyday for that new wave of British heavy metal. and then the explosion of the underground of USA Metal with Metal Blade and Shrapnel Records on the West Coast, and then the opening of Roadrunner here, along with Combat and Megaforce. Roadrunner opened here and was good competition to them all.
This is Alan Becker of Important Records Distribution. He was on the ground floor, where homegrown hard rock and metal was manufactured and distributed throughout the United States. Now here I'm going to recommend that you check out the full chat with Alan Becker, because here I had to cut down the conversation considerably to keep it, flowing in time. But he does plot the route from IRD's beginning all the way up to the heavy metal explosion of 1986. And if you do go back to listen to that episode, strap yourselves in, because if it wasn't for Alan and IRD, your exposure to metal might not have been strong enough to compel you to listen this far in to a great amateur documentary. But here is Alan talking about IRD and how they started their relationship with Roadrunner Records.
So we were just importing their records. We're not distributing the Roadrunner label. We were just importing records from their Dutch distributor called Bertus.
Yep.
Right. And like I said earlier, we were the hard rock experts, the hard rock company, right? At that time, it was just an amazing time, because you had this musical explosions happening of disco and hip hop and rap. And then you had this underground of heavy metal that was just forming. Like what happened there that really took our company into the stratosphere was now local metal labels from all over the world were contacting us and saying, listen, you guys are killing it over there. This is Digby from Earache Records, Digby Pearson.
Yep.
Will you distribute my label, Earache? And we said, okay. It's more stuff like what we're having a home run with, And now there's Karl Walterbach from Noise Records in Germany, right? With his roster.
Brian Slagle, in his book For the Sake of Heaviness, reflects on the 1986 explosion from his perspective. By 1986, there were 3 independent metal labels in the country: Metal Blade, Combat, and Megaforce. All were vying for bands' attentions, and we were all trying to one-up each other while holding our ground in the face of the major labels that were taking an increasing interest in metal acts.
We were a little label at the time, so we clearly can't do everything. So the more there's a Megaforce or a Roadrunner or Combat, or all these labels that involve, I just felt it was better for the scene.
Those 2 labels, Megaforce and Combat, then attracted every hard rock and heavy metal label from all over the world, from Sweden and Denmark and Norway, and of course it was Case Wessels and Roadrunner who said, will you help me distribute my label? And we said, absolutely.
So he was part of that cohort of people from Europe saying, hey.
Right. So we certainly knew of Roadrunner because we were importing their records. Everything that he brought to us sold great.
Yeah.
We couldn't keep anything in stock of any of this stuff because people were just had such a hunk. People, we didn't realize that people actually knew more about these bands in Europe than we thought. Mm-hmm. So that when we brought them in, they just flew off the shelf, and then we had we caught up with the demand.
In order to open up further opportunities for the label, Roadrunner would open up further offices in the UK, Germany, France, Japan, Australia, Denmark, Russia, and Canada.
Yeah, and in the New York office there was Holly Lane and Steve Ricardo.
Well, I had a really good, successful career going at Enigma. And my friend Paul Murata, who ran the New York Green World office, Holly actually started working there, Holly Lane. She worked under Paul. He called me one day and said, "You're an East Coast guy. You've been out in California for too long. I found you something on the East Coast." And I'm like, "All right, what is it?" And he's like, "Roadrunner's opening an office. They want you to come and run the office." And I'm like, Roadrunner? I know a little about them. I knew about Motorhead was affiliated with them in Europe, and Venom, and I knew some of the bands. So I was like, hey, you can't hurt, sure. So Case Wessels flew out to LA and I met him for lunch on the Sunset Strip. I didn't know then that he was straight and sober. And I had several beers during our meeting because I was very young and arrogant at that time.
Right, okay.
he offered me the job basically on the spot. He said, I want you to come to New York. I want you to run our New York office. Holly Lane is already there. You know her, right? And I'm like, I've never met her, but I know who she is. So he's like, are you interested? He offered me a decent deal, decent money, and he gave me some moving expenses. I thought about it, and I took the job. And I said, okay, I'll move to New York. I can tell you right now, years later, and even a year later, I regretted the move. I regretted taking that job.
But more on that next time. So there's a few people in this story who haven't really had their say. There's actually a lot of people who weren't here to give their story. However, there's two I'm going to roll out the red carpet for really briefly, and that's Holly Lane, who you heard of in the last 5 minutes, and Jules Kurz. So Holly opened the US office with Steve Ricardo. She was technically the first US hire for Case, and Jules Kurz was Case's lawyer. Now, the eagle-eyed among you will have spotted his name in one of those articles where I'm trying to track Case's career at the start. But Jules, as I understand it, was effectively Case's first point of contact in the United States prior to 1986, prior to Holly, prior to Steve. So Jules was very much responsible for laying a lot of the foundation to getting Roadrunner where it was, especially in that side of the Atlantic. But both of those guys aren't with us anymore, which is an absolute shame because their input to this story would have been absolutely invaluable. But to give them their fair due, because you're going to hear about them a lot, and I think there's some context that's required, really, I'm going to read out Jules's letter of recommendation of Holly. In 1985, Case Wessel's My Clients opened up Roadrunner Records Incorporated. I recommended Holly Lane to Case. She was interviewed and hired as Chief Operating Officer. During her tenure at Roadrunner, Holly was always the first one in the office every morning and the person who turned off all the lights in the evening. From nothing, Holly created a well-functioning company that laid the base for what today is arguably the leading independent record label in the world operating in the area of heavy metal and hard rock. Holly continued to circulate in the music industries and she continued to build up a repertoire of people she knew in all areas of the music and record business. So I just wanted to shout out on those two. But you'll hear a lot more about them in the next one.
They were like shorting them hundreds of thousands of dollars in
You know, I've had a 30-year career in the music industry, and I look back at my time at Roadrunner and think, I don't even know what I was doing for 2 years. It was kind of silly.
And Monty flipped out. I mean, he's like, who the fuck is this guy? Rob who?
There was a rumor that had gone around that Case Wessels was just a pen name for King Diamond.
I remember Monty calling me and saying, 3 questions, guys, 3 questions, you know, in his New York accent. You know, come on, 3 questions, guys.
The very small wins in that company were the big wins. You know, we got the front cover of a fanzine and we were all jumping up and down and we were really excited, you know, about that.
And the dude's huge, right? He gets in my face, he goes, if you fuck my record up, I will kill you. And I was like, is this guy serious?
To be fair, mate, I've never seen Case and King Diamond in the same room, so... You know.
The jury's still out, right?
The first Merciful Fate record, Melissa, this was the original cover, which never had been used. So it has the Roadrunner stuff, but I don't know who didn't like it, but...
If I can compliment, let's say, enter one thing, I think Roadrunner was the very first metal label that had their albums on CD. Japanese versions, and I still have some, you know, that with the white background that you could put them in 2 halves to open up. This is so typically of Case, you know, tomorrow's thing now.
So if you don't believe what I'm trying to say.
And I remember coming from where I came from, that Roadrunner was one of the first companies who had I really believe we had a computer network.
One American guy, a manager, told me last year, who was actually a good friend of Case, He told me last year that one of the bands in his management team was on the Roadrunner label. The singer, he said, Case is going to be here tonight. He's the owner of Roadrunner. You do a great show, and at the very end of the show, I will give you a signal. You say like, thank you, New York. Thank you, Roadrunner. When we will be back, we're gonna blow your mind, right? And Case was at the show. I don't know how full it was. The band was playing, and then at the end, the manager made the sign to the singer like, "Do your 3 lines," but the guy mixed it up a little bit, and he said, "Thank you, New York. Thank you, Roadrunner. When we're back, we're gonna fuck you in the ass." And then the manager, and while he said that, he looked straight at Case, not knowing it was Case. And the manager said, he said, Case stood there for 2 minutes. And I said, I didn't know what he was going to do. If he's going to be mad, he's going to laugh. And he said, after 2 minutes, Case turned to him and he said, you know what? I've been promised many things in my career, but I've never been promised to be fucked in my ass. And then he laughed. He said, and the next day at 10 a.m. in the morning, a letter from the lawyer came that the band was dropped.
We had no warnings of this, you see, no warnings whatsoever. We were practicing and rehearsing in our own studio. We were very lucky. We had our own rehearsal room. We had our own setup. We just had to walk into the room and practice and play, and rehearse the songs. And my dad came in and said, Dave, there's somebody here that Martin Hooker's sent up. You need to come and have a talk to them. So I came out the room totally unaware what was happening. And my dad said to me, these guys are from Metallica and Martin Hooker sent them up and they want to ask you some questions about touring. So there is the guitarist and somebody else who's probably their road manager or something in Sunderland. This is a God's honest truth. And they were stood there. I didn't know who they were. I didn't know what they'd become. But they asked us if we could go on tour with them in Europe. And we headlined one night and they headlined the next. But we need to use our PA system, which was massive, and our double-decker bus, tour bus. And that up to try and use us with them, which was a great idea. But Brian, our bass player, who was the founder member, had said, "Oh, fuck that, man. We're not playing with them, man. It's not. They're not our kind of music, man. They're not the same. They don't think the same as us." And I went back in the office and said to them, "I'm sorry, guys, we're not interested." And for fuck's sake, how ignorant could I be? I never even offered a cup of tea or a fucking sandwich and out